He was branded a coward at 19, his name crushed by a single false report. The officer who accused him, Captain Kane, built a celebrated career on that lie, while David Miller lived half a century in silence. But one forgotten file in the Pentagon archives uncovered a truth powerful enough to turn his life upside down. And just wait until you hear how this story twisted in the end, and why, after 50 years, justice finally rose to the surface. In the summer of 1969, 19-year-old David Miller stepped off a plane and set foot on American soil again. He was thin, exhausted, his uniform carrying the stains of months spent in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam. Like countless other young men, he had dreamed of returning home to cheers, open arms, and the feeling that his sacrifice meant something. But from the very first day, David realized his homecoming would be nothing like that. There were no parades waiting for him, no banners strung across Main Street. Instead, there were stairs, quiet, sharp, and filled with suspicion. People whispered, and though he could not catch every word, he knew what they were saying. News travels fast in small towns, and in David's hometown of Ohio, one name had already been dragged through the mud before he even came back, his own. The source of this stain was a single report, signed by Captain Richard Kane. In the chaos of battle, Kane had written that David abandoned his post during a firefight. One line, one accusation had the power to erase everything else David had done. On paper, it turned him from a soldier into a deserter. In the eyes of his community, it turned him from a son into a disgrace. At 19, David had carried the weight of war, but back home, he carried something heavier, the weight of a word, coward. It clung to him like a shadow. Every handshake that never came, every door that quietly closed, every glance that slid away the moment he walked into the diner, it all traced back to that single brand. For David, the rejection was relentless. Old neighbors who once patted him on the shoulder as he shipped out now crossed the street to avoid him. Girls who had written him letters during boot camp now giggled when his name was mentioned, their voices carrying the cruel laughter of disbelief. Even within his own family, the wound cut deep. His father, a man of stern pride and few words, looked at him one evening across the dinner table and muttered words that would echo in David's mind for decades. "You shamed our family." That moment struck harder than any blow he had taken in combat. To a boy who had left home, eager to prove his worth, it was unbearable. He wanted to explain. He wanted to shout that the story was wrong, that the truth was far more complicated than the single sentence written in Kane's report. But the world around him had no interest in nuance. People preferred the simple version. A young soldier broke under pressure, ran and betrayed his brothers in arms. And so David lived under that shadow. His medals, if there had been any, would not have mattered. His service, his courage, his sleepless nights in the jungle, none of it mattered. To the town and even to those closest to him, David Miller was no hero. He was the boy who came back alive when others did not. And in their eyes, that alone was enough reason to believe the worst. He had returned from war hoping for peace. Instead, he stepped into a different kind of battlefield. One where every look, every whisper, every memory reminded him that, in the eyes of his world, he was marked forever. The years after David's return stretched into decades, each one carrying the same shadow that had fallen on him in 1969. He never sought recognition, never demanded that the world believe him. Instead, he built a life the only way he knew how, quietly, steadily, with calloused hands and bowed shoulders. Construction sites became his battlefield now. Long days of lifting, hammering, sweating under the sun. His coworkers knew him as reliable, the kind of man who never complained, but none of them saw the storm he carried inside. Every Memorial Day, David walked to the monument downtown. He stood among the crowd, hat in hand, listening as names of the fallen were read aloud. Around him, townsfolk murmured respectfully, but when eyes drifted toward him, the whispers always began. "That's the coward." The words were not shouted, but they cut no less deep for being spoken softly. Each whisper was a reminder that the stain on his name had never faded. At home, David was a provider. He made sure his children had food, clothes, and a roof over their heads. But there was always a distance, an invisible wall that his family could not cross. His son once asked him about the war, wide-eyed with curiosity. David only shook his head and muttered, "Some things aren't worth remembering." That was all he ever said. The boy grew up without stories of courage, without tales of brotherhood, because his father could not bring himself to relive the years that had been turned against him. His wife Sarah saw glimpses of what he tried to hide. She would wake in the night to find him sitting at the edge of the bed, his hands pressed to his face, his breathing uneven. At first, she asked what was wrong, but his answer was always the same. "It's nothing." Over time, she stopped asking. Even in marriage, the full truth remained locked away. The accusation against David did not fade with time. It hardened. It became a silent cross he carried through every stage of his life. Friends moved on, his children grew up, the town itself changed, but the story about him never changed. Once branded, he remained branded. Meanwhile, Captain Richard Kane's life took a very different path. While David labored in obscurity, Kane climbed the ladder of success. He put on new uniforms with brighter stars on his shoulders. He gave interviews on television, speaking with polished authority about duty, courage, and honor. He traveled the country delivering lectures, his name celebrated, his image polished to perfection. David watched some of those programs in silence. The screen showed Kane as a man of stature, a man admired, and every time David saw him speak about discipline or sacrifice, he felt his fists tighten until his knuckles whitened. He wanted to shout, to call out the lie, to tell the world what really happened in that jungle half a century ago, but the words always caught in his throat. The years had taught him that no one wanted to listen, and so David bore it. He bore it through birthdays, anniversaries, empty chairs at reunions, and long nights where memories returned unbidden. He bore it with the quiet endurance of a man who had been denied the chance to clear his name. Decade after decade, he carried his silence, while the world around him celebrated another man's false honor. Half a century passed before a small thread of truth began to unravel the web of silence. In 2019, a young historian named Mark Reynolds was pursuing his graduate research. Unlike many of his peers, he was not drawn to the grand strategies or political speeches of the Vietnam era. What fascinated him were the personal stories, accounts of ordinary soldiers whose lives had been shaped and sometimes broken by the war. Mark often spent long days inside archives, poring over files most people would have considered tedious. He looked for forgotten names, overlooked testimonies, anything that revealed the human side of history. One afternoon, as he worked through a box of recently declassified Pentagon documents, a set of reports caught his eye. They concerned a small skirmish in 1969. At first glance, it looked like just another after-action file, dry, clinical, filled with numbers and brief descriptions. But one detail stood out: the name David Miller. Amour. The report officially stated that Private Miller had abandoned his position during combat. That line matched the narrative that had followed David for 50 years. But as Mark turned the pages, he noticed something strange. Attached to the same file were medical records, witness notes, and a brief statement written by a field medic. These fragments painted an entirely different picture. According to the medic's testimony, Miller had not run from the fight. Instead, under heavy fire, he had dragged 3 wounded comrades to the evacuation zone, shielding them with his own body as explosions shook the ground around them. The medic described Miller as exhausted, barely able to stand by the time the helicopter lifted off. This account directly contradicted the officer's report filed by Captain Richard Kane. Mark leaned back in his chair, stunned. It was clear. The official story was not just incomplete, it was false. Either through error or deliberate choice, Kane's words had erased an act of extraordinary courage and replaced it with a mark of disgrace. For weeks, Mark double-checked everything. He cross-referenced documents, searched for corroborating reports, and verified the authenticity of the files. Every trail led back to the same conclusion: David Miller had been wronged. The truth had been buried beneath paperwork, while the lie had shaped an entire life. Finally, Mark made a decision. He tracked down David Miller, now an old man living quietly on the outskirts of Ohio. When he arrived at the modest house, David opened the door with the wary eyes of someone used to disappointment. Mark introduced himself, explained what he had found, and laid the documents on the kitchen table. For a long time, David said nothing. His eyes scanned the pages slowly, carefully, as if afraid they might disappear. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the words that should have been spoken decades earlier. And then, at last, the silence broke, not with anger, but with tears. They rolled down the face of a man who had not cried in years, perhaps in decades. The weight of injustice was still there, but something had shifted. The anger that had once burned inside him began to transform into something else: resolve. For the first time in half a century, David Miller had proof. Proof that the world had been wrong about him. Proof that he had not failed his brothers, but had stood for them when it mattered most. And in that moment, he knew the truth could no longer remain hidden. Once the truth surfaced, it spread faster than anyone could have expected. At first, it was just a local article written by a regional paper. Then a larger outlet picked it up. Within weeks, David Miller's story was being shared across the country. Headlines described the man once branded a coward who had, in reality, carried his brothers through fire. For the first time in half a century, strangers were no longer whispering his name with suspicion. They were speaking it with respect. Veterans groups quickly rallied around him. Men who had served in different wars reached out, sending letters of support, some handwritten, some typed with shaky hands. They told David that his story gave them hope because they too had known the weight of being misunderstood, forgotten, or judged unfairly. Suddenly, the man who had spent a lifetime in silence was no longer alone. Even lawmakers took notice. Questions were raised, committees convened, and within months, an official decision was made. The record would be corrected. David Miller's service would be formally honored. The Medal for Valor, denied to him in 1969, would finally be placed in his hands. The ceremony was held in Washington, inside a hall where light spilled through tall windows, falling on rows of veterans, officials, families, and reporters. When David walked slowly toward the stage, the room rose to its feet. His hair had turned silver, his shoulders slightly bent with age, but in that moment he carried himself with quiet strength. His hands trembled as he reached for the medal, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what it meant. The applause grew, wave after wave, until it filled the hall. David's children stood in the front row. They had grown up with questions their father never answered, watching him live in silence. Now they saw him differently, not burdened, not ashamed, but standing tall. For the first time, they saw not just their father, but the soldier he had been, the man he had always truly been. When David stepped up to the microphone, the hall grew quiet. His voice was soft, but every word carried. "I'm not a hero," he said. "The real heroes were the men I pulled from the fire. They gave everything. I only did what anyone would have done for a brother." There was humility in his words, but the people listening knew better. They knew that his courage had saved lives, and that his endurance through 50 years of silence was its own form of heroism. Justice had not come swiftly. It had not come easily. But it had come. And as the medal rested against his chest, David Miller's story transformed into more than just his own redemption. It became a beacon for others, proof that even when truth is delayed, it can still rise, and when it does, it can rewrite a life. In that hall, with the applause echoing and his family watching proudly, David Miller was no longer the young man branded by a single false report. He was what he had always been, but had finally been recognized as a man of courage, dignity, and honor.